this forum started, if any of you recall this far back, with me planning to do something on women and how they ruled. There's not a lot of information available about that. And so instead we're going to take a look at David's wives and the stories that accompany them. And also, in particular, I think what might be useful to us is to think about why we hear the stories that we hear, and when we don't hear stories, what that tells us about not only the importance of these women in the history of Israel, but also how women were incredibly secondary to the whole plot of the genealogies of kings. But I think that what you will find, especially when we get to a few of the wives, is that the stories that are told about them seem to contradict each other at certain points, and characterize the wives in ways that are unexpected. They take unexpected twists, and my suspicion, as we hear those stories and make our way through some of the many wives of David, my suspicion is that the narrators are trying to not only frame the presence of these women in David's palace and in his life, but also trying to explain how their presence is commentary on relationships that formed David. So, hope that makes sense. So we'll see it as we make our way through. So King David is the first king who is known for having a united kingdom. Edwin spent some time with you last week trying to help you identify tribes and place names of the places that they are associated with. That is difficult work. And it's multi-layered. It's almost like I said to Edwin, for me it's like an archaeological dig that, you have to, like, okay, so Jacob is given the nickname Israel, and is known then by that name, but what does that say about the origins of a nation and a people of God, right? So we have place names that are associated with people, and we have nicknames that are associated with people, and kind of teasing apart all of those different names that are given to them might be akin to you trying to explain a family nickname that you've received to a friend, right? It might not make any sense in the world. Like, for instance, my older sister used to call me Shrubhead. My hair doesn't exactly, I hope, resemble a shrub. I would imagine maybe with curly hair you might say something like that was really curly and bountiful. But it was because, for some reason, get this, a small child, when my sister was younger, she would hear my parents refer to me when I was a baby as Fuzzhead. And she turned that into Shrubhead. So explaining those things requires a whole narrative of its own, right? And so that's part of what we are looking at as we kind of dig back into the Old Testament stories, is that those individual stories help to shape our understanding of not only who David was, but who people who were related to David were and how they interacted or conflicted with David in particular. So you'll see that as we go along. So here's a brief version of the family tree. And one of the things that you will notice in these names is that, first of all, if you compare this family tree to a Bible passage that gives you some of the lineage, a couple different places in the Old Testament. In Kings and Chronicles, you get the genealogy. You'll notice that the names are, thank you, Gail, for having tackled some of these names in the reading at the 8:30 service. You'll get to see somebody do a stellar job again at 10:45, naming some of these very complicated names. But right away, you'll notice that David, who normally would be, if he were monogamous, would have this kind of tie. Instead, starts with him alone and all the wives of David, and 10 concubines. And if you think that sounds like a lot, wait until you hear about Solomon.
Yeah.
All I can think is the competition was fierce. I was almost going to say something else, but anyway. So 8 wives. There we go. And from them, a slew of sons and one daughter, which is almost a repeated pattern. Do you recognize that many sons, one daughter pattern from before?
Yeah.
Where did that happen?
Story of Joseph.
Yeah, Joseph has one sister, right? So it's Jacob's line, Israel. Okay, here's the first of the wives, and the thing that you should notice about her immediately is that she is identified in the Old Testament as daughter of Saul, first and foremost. And one of the things you will know if you have read through parts of Samuel and into Kings is that there is a feud. Despite the fact that we hear an early story about David helping to calm Saul by playing the harp, the relationship does not stay happy. There is conflict because David gets more attention than Saul, and Saul doesn't like it. So the fact that David is then married to one of Saul's daughters should present you with a question. What would you be curious about?
How did he get permission to do that?
How did he get permission to do that? And what kind of relationship do the in-laws have with the son-in-law, right? So the first thing we hear, it's a really kind of strange story, is that one of Michal's sisters, well, Michal's only other sister, Merab, is actually offered to David, but then somehow that marriage contract is retracted, and he gets Michal instead. And what we hear about Michal's disposition, oh, I see I misspelled her name, is that she loves David. Now, one of the things you should also pay attention to, though, is siblings, because you probably don't even know these names. You know, Ishvi, come on, you guys, and Malchishua. Aren't you glad I'm saying it rather than you? So, but we hear a lot about Jonathan. What do you know about Jonathan and David's relationship to one another?
They were best buds.
They are best buds. In fact, the suggestion is that they're at least bros who say to each other, "I love you, bro."
Yeah.
Okay, if not more intimate. The suggestion is that there is a deeply intimate relationship between Jonathan and David. So now we have Michal, who loves David deeply, and so does Jonathan. And they're brother and sister, and they're from the household of a man who, as he comes to know comes to understand and hear from the crowds the kind of notoriety and blessing that David is receiving, he gets nervous and decides that maybe David is not an asset to his kingdom, but instead he is a rival. And he, despite the fact that Michal loves David deeply, and Jonathan loves David, this is a problem for Saul. Suddenly he not only becomes jealous of David's ability as a warrior to outdo him, Saul, but his kids seem to like David better. Okay? So you can imagine that would create some tension in the palace. So would somebody read this for us from 1 Samuel 18? Peggy, would you read that?
You mean me, this Sandy? Did you say Sandy?
Peggy.
Peggy.
Oh,
Peggy. Good,
oh,
because
yeah.
I can't see
Like
it.
right off of that, okay.
Right. Yeah.
Now Saul's daughter, Michal, loved David. Saul was told, and the thing pleased him. Saul thought, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him.
Okay, so Michal loves David, but what's Saul's intention in marrying Michal off to David?
Make her be bait so other
It's kind of
nations
a
will
Trojan
attack him.
horse
Yes.
kind of effect, right? Bring this woman from his household into David's household, and that'll be a problem for David. Okay, now, fast forward, we're going to turn to, if you have a Bible around you and are willing to read, 2 Samuel 6:16. It's the story, first of all, one of the things you need to know about where David meets his wives is that he marries all of his wives except for Bathsheba when his headquarters are in Hebron. Okay, he doesn't move to and declare Jerusalem the capital city until later. So he has been in Hebron. This story takes us with David coming with the ark into Jerusalem to declare it the capital city. Remember that, where was the first capital for the United States?
New York.
Okay, New York. So you know that countries move capitals, right? And that's what happens here. Okay, who has that for us? Wayne, do you have that? 2 Samuel 6,
6, what is it?
starting at verse 16 and following.
As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart.
Okay, let's go, let's see.
20.
Yeah, through 20.
Through,
Yeah, so 17,
okay. They brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed food among all the people and whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, to each a cake of bread and a portion of meat and a cake of raisins. Then all the people went back to their homes.
and then verse 20 is key.
David returned to bless his household, but Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, maids, as any vulgar fellow might shamelessly uncover himself.
Okay, so we don't know exactly what David was wearing, but evidently Michal has a beef with David and the way he has publicly celebrated bringing the ark, which is at this point the location of God's. It is identified with God's presence, right? So it's part of the mobile unit that includes the tabernacle. There's no temple at this point. And David brings the ark into the city of Jerusalem, but he doesn't just say, come on guys, let's go. What's he doing?
Let's have a party.
He's celebrating, right? This is like my older sister would say when I got too excited and was doing fun things like doing a car dance. You know, she'd, stop it, people are gonna look. Right? So Michal is embarrassed by David's behavior. Now, let's stop for a moment and ask ourselves, what's wrong with this picture? What do we know about Michal's disposition toward David before this? She loved him deeply, right? So some things have gone down in their relationship, including an estrangement where she ends up being married to another man, and then David drags her back to the palace, but she's not getting his attention. And why wouldn't she be getting his attention? I have some clues on the screen for you.
Because she's still sleeping around.
Well, she's not really sleeping around. She's just been kind of cast off and then reclaimed.
Barren.
She doesn't have any kids,
Oh.
okay?
Well, I was just wondering who she's hanging out the window here.
That's David. That's actually a scene of her helping him get away from Saul.
Oh.
Yeah.
I
So
thought
that's
it was
an
a boyfriend
early
out the
scene.
window.
That's back in their the honeymoon period, right? But
Somebody out the window.
so the fact that Michal has no children, you wonder, is that the snare, or is it that because Michal is one of Saul's kids, she's certainly going to defend her dad, and that will become an issue. In all likelihood, it is her barrenness that ends up with her being cast aside by David and then remarried to this other man, but then to be called back by David and still think about what it would be like to be in a house where there are at one point 8 wives all competing for the king's attention. And how do they prove their worth?
Having children.
By having children, right? So she has no way to demonstrate her worth. Do you think that has the potential to make a person sour? It could, right? Or what might be another reason that the Old Testament writers want us to hear this story about Michal souring on David's celebration of bringing the ark into Jerusalem?
Did she marry him to have the powerful king as the husband, dressed up and parading around rather
Right,
than...
well, so it could be that he's just, she deems him an embarrassment to the throne,
Mhm.
right? So this could be kind of Michal buying into the patriarchy, and the man needs to look dignified. But in case any of you have a Southern Baptist background, dancing is actually permitted in the Bible. So the other question that raised for me was, is this meant to amplify the adversarial relationship between Saul's household and David's? Okay, and That's speculation, but it seems to be part of the narrative that continues to be carried out.
What about succession? Because you're basically, and I had never thought about it, but there was no hard rules about succession, but home team advantage to the eldest son. And what we're seeing is that Solomon is from the last of David's wives,
Yes.
and arguably, I don't know his birth order, but definitely after Absalom and after Adonijah. And so,
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up, Edwin. So all of the wives are presented in order of marriage, but what you will see is that it doesn't mean that David has a wife and then has a child, right? It's a very similar pattern to what we see with Jacob's story. He loves Rachel best, but she can't, for some reason, bear children until much later, which creates rivalries within the household, right? So there's a rhythm to the Old Testament stories and the genealogies that seems to tell us that, most especially, that firstborn is no guarantee that you will ascend to the throne, right? Or in the case back in Genesis, firstborn, all the way up to the last chapter of Genesis, Manasseh and Ephraim.
right.
There's this story that the writers of Genesis give us where Jacob, in his very old age, comes into Joseph's palace, and Joseph has purposely brought him there to bless Joseph's children. And Jacob's like, I'm all in. So he comes and he sits down, and the boys kneel in front of him, and Joseph positions the boys just right so that the right-hand blessing will indicate the child who will be heir to the tradition and the customs and the power of the family. What does Jacob do? This pattern in the Old Testament happens over and over and over again, which tells us that while human customs may fit with our understanding that it's supposed to be the firstborn who inherits, right? In my family, my older sister, who also happens to be a lawyer, is the executor of my parents' will, right? It kind of continues sometimes that way, or there's a catch, and the oldest is deemed not the appropriate person for it, and then maybe the oldest will be asking, hey, what about me, right? So we have these expectations that are buried somewhere in our experience, and regularly we think, well, the neat, tidy way to take care of things is the oldest is the one who inherits and is responsible for the distribution of the estate, right? And with wives, you would imagine that Michael would think, hey, I love the guy, I should be the one that gives birth to the child who will ascend to the throne. But she has no children. Okay, so that's Michael. Abigail next. Love that name. If I'd had a third daughter, I would have named her Abigail. She is the widow of Nabal. And this is a story about David when he is still in this ongoing dispute with Saul. His troops are hungry. He comes across this woman who comes out to him and appeals to him and says, whatever you need, let me do it for you. And goes back to her husband Nabal, and Nabal says, I'm not doing a dang thing for those soldiers. And Abigail, what we hear is that he dies, and his death is like turning to stone, I think is the phrase. It's very unclear exactly how this happens, but he is a rock of the wrong kind. Okay. So Abigail gives birth to one child, Chileab, who for some reason likes to go by Daniel more often. This is another child born in Hebron. Jeannie, can you see what this says here? Are you able to read that? Would you read that for us?
The woman was clever and beautiful, but the man, her husband, Nabal, was surly and mean.
Okay.
Interesting.
So after Nabal dies, David looks at Abigail and says, "Clever and beautiful. Come along with me." She gets called into the palace. Interesting story that actually features this woman's cleverness, right? Which tells you that it's not just beauty. It's also good to be smart. If any of you have watched shows like Bridgerton, I don't know if any of you have seen that. This is, I just started to watch the first episode of the second season, and one of the brothers of, is it the Featheringtons? Can't remember. And, no, it's the main family. Anyway, he has decided that he's going to go through a very carefully worked out process for vetting potential wives. And so he wants to know what languages they speak. He wants to know if they are adept at riding horses, you know, all of the things that are important. And he is unable to be satisfied because his expectations are so high. In this case, Abigail, being clever and beautiful, wins the day. So it's not just her beauty, but her brains. Ahinoam, who we are told is of a place called Jezreel, has the first of the children. Let's back up here. Chileab was number 2, okay? Second wife has the second child. Ahinoam has the first, and his name is Amnon. Oh boy, Amnon has a bad history. He is the one who has a sibling that we know of. No, he doesn't have siblings, sorry. He doesn't have a direct sibling, but he has an eye for his half-sister. Okay, so, Ahinoam, we're told in various places, and this is what we get is just little snippets of information about some of these wives. She is the daughter of Ahimaaz, who may have been a widow of Saul. It's kind of unclear. And then in 2 Samuel 12 we hear God speaking to David saying, "I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom." So if Ahinoam is a widow of Saul, this verse in 2 Samuel is meant to explain that. You tracking with me?
Yeah.
To all the girls I've loved before. Okay. Maacah. She is the daughter of King Talmai of Geshur. She bears the third son. So the second wife bears the second son, the third wife bears the first son, and the fourth wife bears the third son. Is your head spinning yet?
Yeah.
Okay. She also not only has a son who is born in Hebron, but after David moves the capital to Jerusalem, she gives birth to a daughter named Tamar. Interestingly, Tamars do not do well
No, they don't.
in the Hebrew Testament. That's all I have to say. She ends up being the victim of Amnon. There is a horrible family rivalry between Absalom and Amnon. There are lots of me'akas. I put this in here on purpose because I want you to see why why your brain might be spinning as you're trying to read through some of the Old Testament stories. There are many, many me'akas throughout 1st, 2nd Kings and Chronicles, some of which may refer to this me'aka or not. So you keep having names. It's like having John show up all the time. You know, okay, are we talking about John the Baptist? Or are we talking about John the disciple? Or are we talking about John the gospel writer? Right? Are they all the same or are they different? How about John in Revelation? Oh my goodness.
Right.
Which one is it? Okay. This is an important note though. In 2nd Chronicles 11, the daughter of Absalom is the wife of Rehoboam. And Edwin, who is Rehoboam?
Rehoboam would be Solomon's, Solomon's son.
And isn't he the first king of the divided
Of the
kingdom?
Judah, of the divided kingdom.
Okay. So, so you can see new family lines
Yeah.
developing here. Okay. And by the way, this picture of Rehoboam, it's not authentic. Okay, Abital. You've heard of her, right? She gives birth to the 5th son, Shephatiah. Thanks for that name, Mom. Notice that his birthplace is in Hebron. And the only references that we have to her and him are in the genealogies. So some of them just, that's the most that we get. So I have this very blurry picture for you with a question mark. Do we need to know anything more? I guess not. Another question mark, Haggith, although we do hear about Haggith more prominently in the story that you're going to hear from the Old Testament at worship, or have heard. Haggith is the mother of Adonijah, and that is pretty much as we know about her. Okay? So you can see that developing a narrative around these women who give birth to the potential kings of Israel was not deemed important, except for where their prodigy line up in the narrative later, right? So Adonijah shows up in the narrative later. Eglah. I thought this was a really nice picture of Eglah, and I was trying to figure out what artist in the world was thinking, it's just not fair that Eglah does not have a portrait of her. Because there was only one, as far as I could tell, in all of creation that had actually painted a picture. So lucky Eglah, she got some tribute to her. She gives birth to the 6th son, Ithream, and that's as much as we know about her. These again are just the genealogies. Bathsheba, or is it Bathsheba?
Could be I.
So Bathsheba is at certain points in the genealogy referred to as Bathsheba. And the reason that we are certain that these names are used interchangeably or are meant to indicate the same person is because the genealogies between the two books that we've been looking at align, right? So Bathsheba who is identified in two different places as being the daughter of Eliam or the daughter of Amiel. All of the same letters, just mixed up, right? Except an extra M. She is also identified in Scripture as the widow of Uriah, particularly in the Old Testament as the widow of Uriah. In Matthew's genealogy that takes us through David's line to the birth of Jesus, she is referred to as the wife of Uriah, which is interesting. Like, wait a minute. If she was married to Uriah, there must be a story that we need to pay attention to there. And I think that that's exactly what the gospel writer intends, right? To make us curious about these genealogies. What I want you to notice here, though, is the artwork and what it says to us about Bathsheba. What do you think of this one? She could be. She's pretty sexy for being pregnant, too. And it almost looks like, she almost resembles, I don't know, I want to say, like, Victorian seductress or something.
Well, the dates on these paintings would be interesting because it's less significant to us, but red is the color of passion. And I can even remember my grandmother having not kind words to say about women who wore red on
Red
something,
dresses.
right? So,
Everybody check to make
she's
sure.
in,
Oh,
there's a
it's
lot
steady.
of, there's a lot, awful lot of red on
Uh-huh.
some of these depictions.
The red light district.
Yeah, red light
Still.
district.
Well,
Yeah.
so part of my point is the paintings do suggest something,
Right.
right? And as you'll hear in my sermon, if you haven't already, this is something that happens with Scripture, that we read into Scripture, that even as little as saying David and Bathsheba had an affair, that assumes consent on both of their parts. We don't actually hear that
Right.
in the story of Bathsheba. And this tells you something about the period of history that they were living in, right? Where, not unlike what Kate talked about with Esther, you don't get a choice about where your future takes you, except how well you're going to live into the status that you're given, and whether you're going to be miserable or accept where you're at. But Bathsheba has this whole kind of narrative that goes with her from the culture, right? So when we open up the Bible, we're often already reading that narrative from the sermons that have been preached by Billy Graham or Franklin Graham or, Jerry Falwell or whomever, right, about Bathsheba and David. That makes it harder when we actually open up the actual text to think about what was this relationship, right? This was after she had 4 sons. But again, as Edwin pointed out, the color is suggestive, right?
Flimsy neckline.
And then, look at this woodcut. Oh my goodness. This is like, this belongs nearly in Canterbury Tales. Right? If you don't know Canterbury Tales, Middle English literature, where there's some really bawdy humor,
Yeah.
right? Suggestive, if not outright, kind of crude. That's what this picture reminds me of. And there were lots of woodcuts. I mean, this is probably from what, 14 or the
It's probably
15th
15th century.
15th century, 1400s. the writing up here says the Psalms of David, but that's not what this is referring to. This is referring to the scene where Bathsheba is bathing and David sees her. Does it look like a purification bath? So see how art influences how we perceive this relationship? The last couple of pictures are part of the narrative for today's sermon. This is David at the end of his life, cold. I would suggest he doesn't just need a cuddle buddy, he probably needs warmer clothing. Here's the interesting thing. We're told that David's only 70 years old. He has not weathered well.
But all those women, he's had to take care of.
He's exhausted. That's right. Poor guy. Anyway.
8 wives and 10 sons.
But this is Bathsheba appealing
Yeah.
to him on his deathbed, right? And this is Bathsheba hearing the plea of Adonijah after Bathsheba has won David's blessing for Solomon. And Adonijah now knows he's on the out and he's been discovered because, guess what? He was planning to ascend to the throne of his own volition. Because if David didn't make any blessing, he figured by default and by having the commander of the army with him and one of the priests who was most influential, he was going to have the power he needed to ascend to the throne. So now he's got to do some groveling. Right? Bathsheba is also referred to as Bathsheba, and she has 4 sons. Solomon is 6th among the sons. 8 wives. She is the 8th wife, but she has the 6th son. And then in one of the Old Testament's et ceteras, we get in 1 Chronicles 3. And there were all these other boys that were born, some to Bathsheba, and then, all those other ones, basically is what it says. But notice, again, what the gospel writer picks up on. Matthew, whose gospel is sometimes understood to be a kind of catechetical work, like a gospel of instruction. It's meant to wed the Hebrew tradition with this new appeal about Christ crucified and risen. Wants us to know that in the midst of all of these Hebrew people, there are a smattering of people from other nations. And remember, nations at this point meant basically tribes with small territories. There are all of these nations that are not part of the ongoing heritage, who somehow get woven into Jesus's genealogy, which is a hint to us that it's kind of bred in the bone, right? That Jesus is, by virtue of the tradition and the lineage out of which he comes, going to be looking, as the prophets have said, for himself, as one of God's people, to be blessed, to be a blessing, like Abraham, right? That to the other nations. So while we hear a lot in the Old Testament about, let's keep to ourselves, let's keep, traditions clean, we also hear a lot about foreigners coming into the picture and actually having a positive impact. And Bathsheba is a Hittite. And Matthew clearly wants us to know more she was also married to somebody else before David, right? And what does that tell us? That God redeems sinners and continues to work through history to bring about God's promises. Right? So these genealogies and these marriages end up telling us a bigger story about how God is at work in the world. Make sense? That's what I have for you.
Okay.
This is the etc. Other children of undesignated wives: Ibhar, Elishama, Eliphalet, Noga, Nepheg, Jephiah, Jeremoth. Are you resonating with my attempts to say this right? And Elishama is listed again in this same listing. Does that mean there were two Elishamas that were born to David, or are they just repeating themselves and not realizing it? Eladad and Eliphalet. So there's repetition even within a single genealogy that makes it unclear to us whether there are two siblings who have the exact same name. Okay?
Well, lots of wives, you can have lots of.
I know. But part of what I want to do is give you permission to go, huh? Right? I mean, it's okay to do that, but to take notice that in a kingdom where a king has 8 wives, at a certain point, Dad, who is loosely connected to most of these wives, is probably going to be more loosely connected to, the etc. kids. And then the other thing that happens at the end of the first in this genealogy in First Chronicles is that we get mention of people who aren't even directly in David's line, but who have very influential roles. One of them being Joab, who is the commander of the army. Okay, so if you're confused, there might be a reason. And then part of the etc. and Tamar, sister of Absalom. Okay.
Fun family picnic.
You redeemed yourself with that page. I kept waiting in the sermon to hear more of those names that I struggled